Some hearts do not break because they lose someone. They break the moment they realize that someone was never theirs to lose. Damien Sullivan had built an empire where every decision obeyed his command. Every room fell silent when he entered, and every rival understood that crossing his path came with consequences they could not afford. The marble halls of his secluded estate reflected power from every polished surface, while armed security, luxury vehicles, and priceless artwork reminded every visitor that nothing inside those gates existed by accident. Yet there was one person who moved through that mansion without fear, not because she was brave enough to challenge him, but because she had never cared about his wealth in the first place. Naomi Carter arrived every morning before sunrise carrying nothing more than a worn leather tote filled with medical supplies, handwritten notes, and homemade herbal tea that she insisted helped him sleep better after endless nights of stress. She was a plus-size black caregiver whose gentle voice somehow softened even the coldest corners of the enormous estate. She never asked about business meetings, never questioned late-night phone calls, and never treated Damien like the powerful mafia boss everyone else saw. To her, he was simply another patient who forgot to eat on time, skipped his medication when he became distracted, and worked far too many hours without rest. That quiet honesty irritated Damien during the first weeks she worked for him. Then, without him realizing when it happened, it became the one part of every day he unconsciously expected. She reminded him to drink water before meetings. She noticed when headaches were beginning before he admitted they existed. She could tell from the way he loosened his tie whether he needed silence or conversation. She never crossed professional boundaries, yet somehow understood him better than people who had known him for decades. Damien never called it comfort because comfort sounded dangerously close to dependence, and dependence was something he had forbidden himself long ago. One Friday evening, after finishing a difficult week filled with negotiations and endless phone calls, Damien happened to glance through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the front courtyard. The setting sun painted the stone driveway with warm shades of gold as Naomi stepped outside, wearing a navy blue dress instead of her usual medical scrubs. Her hair, normally tied back during work, rested neatly across her shoulders, and there was a smile on her face unlike any he had ever seen inside the mansion. It was lighter, freer, as though the weight she quietly carried every day had disappeared for one evening. A silver sedan rolled through the front gate exactly on time. A well-dressed man stepped out holding a small bouquet of white lilies before opening the passenger door with unmistakable kindness. Naomi laughed softly at something he said before accepting the flowers. Damien remained perfectly still behind the glass. He had watched business rivals, politicians, and billionaires without showing the slightest emotion, yet the simple sight of another man making Naomi smile tightened something deep inside his chest. He could not explain the unfamiliar feeling. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something quieter, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous because it ignored every rule that had governed his life. As the sedan disappeared beyond the estate gates, Damien continued staring at the empty driveway long after the taillights had vanished into the evening, suddenly realizing that for the first time in many years, the coldest man in the room was no longer in control of his own heart. Damien Sullivan told himself that he had simply been curious. That was the explanation he repeated as his black sedan remained 3 vehicles behind the silver car, carrying Naomi Carter across the quiet streets of downtown Chicago. He ignored the uncomfortable truth growing heavier with every passing mile. Men like him did not follow people. They gathered information. They verified facts. They protected their interests. At least that was what he wanted to believe. The silver sedan finally stopped outside a small family-owned Italian restaurant tucked between an old bookstore and a neighborhood bakery. It was nothing like the exclusive places Damien usually visited. Warm lights glowed behind large windows. Families laughed over dinner, and fresh flowers decorated every table. Naomi stepped out first, still carrying the bouquet of white lilies. The man beside her smiled as he held the restaurant door open. Damien watched from across the street, his hands resting motionless on the steering wheel. Through the front window, he could see them sitting together near the corner of the dining room. They talked easily. Naomi laughed again, the same gentle laugh he had heard only a few times inside the estate when one of the gardeners accidentally told a funny story or when an elderly patient shared an old memory. Seeing that smile directed toward someone else unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He convinced himself that he was studying the man for practical reasons. The stranger appeared to be in his late 30s, neatly dressed, polite with the staff, and attentive without becoming overly familiar. He listened carefully whenever Naomi spoke, and more than once he pushed the breadbasket toward her before serving himself. Damien searched for flaws. Was the man arrogant, dishonest, impatient, or disrespectful? Every small observation disappointed him because the answer remained the same. The stranger behaved with quiet kindness. Nearly an hour passed before the waiter delivered a thin envelope to the table. Naomi accepted it with both hands and read several pages carefully. At one point, she wiped away a single tear before smiling again. The man reached across the table, not to hold her hand, but simply to slide a box of tissues toward her. Damien could not hear a single word through the glass, so his imagination filled every silence with conclusions that felt increasingly painful. He assumed they were discussing a future together. He imagined promises, plans, and dreams that no longer included the mansion where Naomi spent nearly every day caring for him. When dinner ended, they walked outside carrying leftovers in simple paper bags. The man opened the passenger door once again before they drove away into the cool evening. Damien did not follow this time. Instead, he remained parked beneath a streetlight long after. The restaurant had emptied, staring at the reflection of the city in his windshield. The logical part of his mind reminded him that Naomi owed him nothing beyond her professional responsibilities. She had every right to spend her evening with anyone she chose. Yet logic failed to silence the unfamiliar weight pressing against his chest. By the time he returned to the estate just before midnight, he had already convinced himself of something that was never supported by evidence. He believed he had just watched the woman he depended on quietly fall in love with someone else. The following Monday morning felt strangely different, although nothing inside the Sullivan estate had visibly changed. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, fresh coffee waited in the dining room, and Damien Sullivan's schedule remained as demanding as ever. Yet every familiar routine now carried an uncomfortable silence that had not existed before. Naomi Carter arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, greeting the security team with her usual warm smile before carrying her medical bag upstairs. She reviewed his blood pressure, reminded him to eat breakfast before his first meeting, and carefully adjusted the sleeve of his shirt so the blood pressure cuff would fit comfortably. She behaved exactly as she always had. Damien, however, did not. His answers became shorter. His eyes rarely met hers. When she asked whether he had slept well, he simply replied that he had been busy. Naomi noticed the change immediately, but she respected personal boundaries too much to press for an explanation. Throughout the morning, she quietly observed details that no one else seemed to notice. Damien skipped half his breakfast, even though he normally finished every meal she prepared. He ignored 2 cups of coffee until they became cold. During an important conference call, he paused twice after losing track of what he intended to say, something she had never witnessed before. She gently suggested a short break between meetings, but he declined without looking up from the documents spread across his desk. None of his words sounded angry. They simply sounded distant. The emotional distance troubled Naomi far more than open frustration ever could. As the week continued, the quiet tension only grew stronger. Damien found himself watching the clock each afternoon without understanding why. When Naomi stepped outside to answer a personal phone call, he unconsciously looked toward the window until she returned. Whenever her phone vibrated with a message, he wondered if it came from the man at the restaurant. Every unanswered question slowly became an imagined answer. One afternoon, Naomi requested permission to leave an hour early on Friday. She explained that she had an important personal appointment she had been planning for several weeks. Damien signed the request without hesitation, but the words echoed in his mind long after she left the office. An important appointment. His imagination immediately connected it to the dinner he had witnessed. He wanted to ask who she would be meeting, yet the question never left his lips because he knew he had no right to ask it. Later that evening, Samuel Carter entered Damien's private office to review security reports from several business properties. Halfway through the meeting, Samuel noticed Damien staring absent-mindedly through the window instead of reading the documents placed before him. "Something is distracting you," Samuel said carefully. Damien remained silent for several seconds before responding with unusual restraint. I want to know more about someone Naomi has been spending time with. Samuel looked surprised, but asked no unnecessary questions. Years of working together had taught him that Damien never requested information without believing it mattered. Do you believe she is in danger? Samuel asked. Damien hesitated. The honest answer was no. Every memory from the restaurant suggested exactly the opposite. The man had been respectful, patient, and kind. Yet Damien could not explain the growing weight inside his chest. I do not know, he finally admitted. Find out who he is. Samuel quietly accepted the assignment, unaware that the investigation he had just begun would uncover a truth completely different from the one Damien had already convinced himself was real. Samuel Carter approached every investigation the same way, whether he was reviewing a multi-million-dollar security contract or answering a simple question from Damien Sullivan. He believed assumptions created mistakes, while facts created answers. By Thursday afternoon, a thin folder rested on Samuel's desk containing everything he had managed to verify about the man Naomi Carter had met for dinner. The report surprised him because nothing inside suggested deception or hidden motives. The man's name was Benjamin Hayes, a respected estate planning attorney with an office in downtown Chicago. His professional record was spotless, his reputation among clients was excellent, and his schedule showed no connection to any criminal organization or business competitor connected to Damien. Even more surprising, Benjamin specialized in helping families prepare medical directives, guardianship agreements, and long-term care planning. Samuel quietly closed the folder before carrying it upstairs to Damien's private office. Damien listened without interrupting as Samuel summarized every verified detail. There is no indication that Mr. Hayes presents any threat, Samuel concluded. His career has focused almost entirely on elder care planning and family legal services. Everything about him appears legitimate. Damien remained silent, but the report failed to bring him the relief Samuel expected. Instead, it raised even more questions. If Benjamin was simply an attorney, why had Naomi looked so emotional during dinner? Why had she accepted flowers? Why had she refused to mention any of it? Later that afternoon, Naomi arrived carrying Damien's updated medication schedule and several laboratory reports from his annual physical examination. She immediately noticed the unopened lunch tray resting on the side table. You skipped another meal, she said gently. You promised your physician you would stop doing that. Damien barely looked up from the paperwork in front of him. I was busy. Naomi smiled patiently. You always say that when something else is bothering you. For the first time all week, Damien looked directly into her eyes. The question almost escaped before he stopped himself. He wanted to ask whether she was seeing someone. He wanted to ask who Benjamin Hayes really was to her. Instead, pride spoke louder than honesty. Your personal schedule seems unusually busy lately, he said in a calm but distant voice. Naomi looked slightly confused. Only outside working hours. Damien nodded once without another word. The conversation ended there, leaving both of them unsatisfied for completely different reasons. Naomi quietly gathered the untouched lunch tray before leaving the office. As she reached the doorway, Damien noticed a familiar white envelope partially visible inside her leather tote. It looked almost identical to the one she had received during dinner at the restaurant. She carefully adjusted the bag before disappearing into the hallway. Damien stared after her, allowing silence to replace the questions he refused to ask. Downstairs, Naomi paused near the estate garden before taking out her phone. She read a new message from Benjamin that simply confirmed their appointment for the following evening. A small smile crossed her face, followed almost immediately by a deep breath. Just one more meeting, she whispered softly to herself. Then everything will finally be finished. Unknown to Naomi, one of the estate's newer security employees happened to notice her reading the message from a distance. Believing any unusual visitor connected to the household might interest senior security staff, he quietly included Benjamin's name in the routine activity report submitted at the end of his shift. Before the sun had fully disappeared beyond the Chicago skyline, that report was already waiting on Samuel Carter's desk, bringing with it a new question that neither Damien nor Naomi could possibly anticipate. Friday arrived beneath a gray Chicago sky, and the atmosphere inside the Sullivan estate felt heavier than the weather outside. Damian Sullivan buried himself in meetings from sunrise until late afternoon, yet every conversation drifted away from his attention. Financial reports blurred together. Negotiations lasted longer than necessary, and even Samuel Carter noticed that the normally disciplined Mafia Boss seemed distracted by thoughts he refused to share. Shortly after 3 o'clock, Samuel entered the office carrying the updated activity report prepared by the security team. "There is one new detail," he said calmly. "Benjamin Hayes is scheduled to meet Naomi again this evening." Damian slowly placed his pen on the desk. "Where?" Samuel answered without hesitation. "His law office." The appointment was confirmed through a message observed during routine security reporting. "Everything still appears consistent with legal business." Damian nodded, but the explanation only deepened the conflict inside him. If the meetings were truly related to legal work, why had Naomi never mentioned them? Why had she protected the information so carefully? By the time Naomi arrived for her final afternoon health check, Damian had already decided to ask the question he had avoided all week. She entered carrying his medication organizer and smiled with the same quiet kindness that had slowly become part of the rhythm of the estate. "Your blood pressure has improved," she said after reviewing the monitor. "You have finally been sleeping better again." Damian looked at her for several seconds before speaking. "Are you seeing someone?" The room became completely still. Naomi blinked in surprise, clearly unprepared for the question. She lowered the blood pressure monitor onto the table before answering carefully. "Why would you ask me that?" Damian immediately realized how personal the question sounded, yet there was no honest way to take it back. "Because I have noticed changes," he replied. Naomi hesitated, searching for words that would protect a promise she had made only days earlier. "There are some personal matters I need to finish," she said softly. "I cannot explain everything yet, but I promise no part of it affects my work here." Damian heard every word, but his emotions listened only to what she had not said. She had not denied meeting Benjamin. She had not explained the flowers, the dinners, or the envelopes. Silence filled every missing answer with another assumption. Naomi noticed the disappointment in his expression and quietly added, "When everything is complete, you will understand." Damian forced a polite nod. "You do not owe me an explanation." The sentence sounded respectful, but both of them sensed the distance growing wider between them. Naomi packed her medical equipment in silence before leaving for her appointment downtown. Nearly an hour later, she stepped into Benjamin Hayes' office carrying the same leather tote she had used every day at the estate. Benjamin greeted her warmly before spreading several legal documents across the conference table. At the top of the first page appeared the words "last will" and "testament," followed by additional paperwork transferring long-term medical authority for Naomi's elderly mother into a charitable care program established according to her late father's final wishes. Naomi quietly signed the first document, relieved that years of uncertainty were finally coming to an end. At that exact moment, miles away inside the Sullivan estate, Damian stood alone beside the window, completely unaware that the secret he feared most had never been a love story at all. By the beginning of the following week, Damian Sullivan had convinced himself that distance was the safest choice. He stopped asking Naomi Carter to stay for evening conversations after her work was finished, scheduled more meetings away from the estate, and buried every uncomfortable emotion beneath endless business decisions. On the surface, nothing appeared unusual. Naomi continued caring for him with the same patience and professionalism she had shown from her first day, but she quietly sensed that an invisible wall now existed between them. She blamed herself for it without understanding why. More than once she considered telling Damian the truth about Benjamin Hayes. Yet every time she remembered the promise she had made to keep the legal process completely confidential until every document had been approved and filed. Benjamin had explained that discussing unfinished estate planning could create unnecessary confusion if unexpected legal issues appeared. Naomi wanted to honor that advice, believing she would explain everything once the final paperwork was complete. Unfortunately, someone else had already begun paying attention to the growing distance between them. Across the city, one of Damian's longtime business rivals, Victor Kane, regularly collected information about the Sullivan organization through legal public records and harmless observations that attracted little attention. A routine report eventually mentioned that Damien's trusted caregiver had recently been seen meeting several times with an attorney outside the estate. Victor saw an opportunity where everyone else saw an ordinary appointment. He did not know the purpose of the meetings, but he understood one important fact. Whenever trusted people appeared surrounded by unanswered questions, misunderstandings often became more powerful than the truth itself. Victor quietly instructed one of his assistants to learn everything possible about Naomi's schedule without contacting her directly or breaking any laws. Meanwhile, Samuel Carter completed one final background review on Benjamin Hayes. Every answer remained exactly the same. Benjamin was respected throughout the community, specialized in elder care planning, and had devoted much of his career to helping families protect aging parents. Samuel finally placed the file on Damien's desk. "I have checked every available record," he said. "There is nothing suspicious about him. If there is a secret here, it is not connected to Mr. Hayes." Damien slowly closed the folder. For the first time since the investigation had begun, he realized that the only person he had never truly trusted was Naomi, and that realization unsettled him more than any report Samuel had delivered. Later that afternoon, Naomi received a phone call confirming that every legal document had been approved. Her mother's transfer into the charitable long-term care program established through her late father's wishes would become official within 48 hours. Relief filled her eyes. The burden she had carried for years was finally lifting. She quietly decided that after everything became official, she would explain the entire situation to Damien and apologize for the misunderstanding her silence had unintentionally created. She had no idea that Victor Kane's assistant was already watching the entrance to Benjamin Hayes' office from across the street, taking careful notes about arrival times, departures, and every visible detail. No crime had been committed. No threats had been made. Yet a simple misunderstanding had quietly attracted the attention of someone willing to turn unanswered questions into a dangerous advantage. While neither Damien nor Naomi realized that the truth they had both been avoiding was about to become far more complicated than either of them expected. Tuesday morning began with a rare sense of relief for Naomi Carter. Before leaving for the Sullivan estate, she received the final confirmation from Benjamin Hayes that every legal document had been officially recorded. Her late father's charitable trust had now taken full responsibility for her mother's long-term medical care, ensuring she would receive treatment without Naomi carrying the impossible financial burden alone. For the first time in years, Naomi drove to work feeling lighter than she could remember. She quietly promised herself that before the day ended, she would finally explain everything to Damien Sullivan. No more unanswered questions. No more uncomfortable silence. She believed honesty would erase the distance that had grown between them. She had no idea someone else intended to make certain that conversation never happened. Victor Kane had already received a detailed report from his assistant. The information contained nothing illegal or scandalous. It simply confirmed that Naomi had visited Benjamin Hayes several times during the past few weeks, and that every meeting had remained private. Victor smiled as he closed the folder. He understood that people rarely needed lies to destroy trust. They only needed carefully timed misunderstandings. Later that afternoon, Naomi finished Damien's routine medical examination and noticed the familiar exhaustion in his eyes. Although his physical condition remained excellent, the emotional strain of recent weeks had become impossible to ignore. She gathered enough courage to speak. "Mr. Sullivan, I was hoping we could talk after your last meeting today. There is something important I should have explained sooner." Damien looked at her for a brief moment before answering. "I have a dinner meeting downtown. We can speak tomorrow." Naomi forced a small smile, even though disappointment quietly settled across her face. Tomorrow is fine. She respected his decision without argument, believing one more day would not matter. Unfortunately, Victor had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Early that evening, Benjamin Hayes called Naomi with unexpected news. One final notarized document required her signature before the legal process could be completely closed. The appointment would take less than 20 minutes. Naomi immediately agreed, grateful that the final step was so close. As she entered Benjamin's office shortly after sunset, Victor's assistant remained across the street, observing every arrival exactly as instructed. Within minutes, an anonymous message reached Damien's private phone. It contained only a recent photograph showing Naomi entering Benjamin's office and a single sentence beneath it. Some meetings are worth hiding. Damien stared at the screen without speaking. There was no signature, no explanation, and no demand. Samuel Carter, who happened to be reviewing security reports nearby, noticed Damien's expression immediately. "Where did that come from?" he asked. Damien handed him the phone. Samuel studied the message carefully before looking back at his employer. "Anonymous messages are designed to create emotional reactions," he said calmly. "They rarely tell the whole story." Damien remained silent. Every instinct built through years of difficult decisions told him Samuel was right. Yet another part of him remembered the restaurant, the flowers, the sealed envelopes, and every unanswered question that had followed. For several long seconds, he stood motionless before making a decision unlike any he had made during the previous weeks. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, picked up his car keys, and quietly said, "I am done guessing. This time I am going to hear the truth from Naomi herself." As Samuel followed him toward the front entrance, neither man realized that choosing trust over suspicion was about to unravel a misunderstanding far greater than either of them had imagined. The evening traffic moved slowly through downtown Chicago as Damien Sullivan's black sedan came to a quiet stop across the street from Benjamin Hayes's office. Samuel Carter remained beside him, saying nothing because years of experience had taught him that some decisions required silence instead of advice. Damien looked once more at the anonymous message still displayed on his phone before locking the screen. For the first time since all of this had begun, he realized that every conclusion he had reached had been built upon things he had never actually heard Naomi Carter say. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance with steady confidence, determined to trust facts instead of fear. Upstairs, Benjamin organized the final documents into a neat folder before offering Naomi a warm smile. "Congratulations," he said. "Everything is officially complete. Your mother's medical care is now fully protected under your father's charitable trust. You will never have to worry about paying for her treatment alone again." Naomi slowly closed her eyes as relief washed over her face. For years she had worked extra shifts, saved every possible dollar, and quietly carried burdens she never wanted anyone else to see. She had accepted the caregiver position at the Sullivan estate because it offered stability, not because she expected anyone to solve her problems. "Thank you," she whispered. "My father would have wanted this." Benjamin handed her the final certified copies before adding, "He also left one personal letter for you. He asked that it be delivered only after everything was finished." Naomi carefully opened the envelope and smiled through quiet tears as she recognized her father's familiar handwriting. The letter reminded her that accepting help was never a sign of weakness, and that true strength came from caring for others without losing compassion for herself. At that exact moment, Damien reached the reception area outside Benjamin's office. The receptionist politely informed him that the meeting was almost finished and invited him to wait. Through the partially open office door, Damien could hear only a few quiet sentences. "Your mother is safe now," Benjamin said gently. "Your father planned every detail because he knew how much you would sacrifice for her." Damien stopped walking. Every assumption he had carried for weeks suddenly began falling apart. There had never been secret romance. There had never been hidden promises between two people building a future together. There had only been a devoted daughter honoring her late father's wishes while protecting her mother's future with quiet dignity. Damien lowered his head as regret settled heavily across his heart. Moments later, the office door opened, and Naomi stepped into the hallway holding the folder against her chest. She looked genuinely surprised to see Damien standing there. "Mr. Sullivan?" she asked softly. Before she could say another word, Damien spoke with a sincerity she had never heard from him before. "I owe you an apology." Naomi looked at him with quiet confusion while Benjamin respectfully excused himself, sensing that the conversation belonged to them alone. Damien took a slow breath before continuing. "I allowed silence to become suspicion. I believed my own fears instead of trusting the person who has always been honest with me." Naomi remained still for several seconds before opening the folder and gently handing him the letter from her father along with the completed legal documents. Damien read enough to understand everything. When he finally looked up again, he saw not only the caregiver who had patiently cared for him every day, but also a woman who had quietly carried responsibilities far greater than he had ever imagined. And in that moment, he understood that love could never grow where trust did not exist first. 6 months later, the Sullivan estate felt different in ways that could never be measured by security reports, financial records, or business success. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight. The gardens remained perfectly maintained, and Damian Sullivan continued leading his organization with the same discipline that had earned him respect throughout Chicago. Yet the people who worked beside him noticed a quiet change that no one had expected. He listened longer before making decisions. He asked questions before reaching conclusions. Most importantly, he never underestimated honest people simply because they held ordinary jobs. Naomi Carter continued serving as his caregiver, although her responsibilities gradually expanded beyond his daily medical care. Damian invited her to help establish a new wellness program for every employee working across his properties, believing that health, dignity, and compassion should never depend upon a person's position or paycheck. Naomi accepted only after making one condition perfectly clear. Every employee, from senior executives to maintenance workers, would receive the same respect and access to care. Damian agreed without hesitation because he finally understood why that principle mattered so much. One autumn afternoon, the program officially opened inside a newly renovated wellness center funded through the Sullivan Foundation. Doctors, nurses, counselors, and community volunteers gathered to celebrate the beginning of a project designed to support workers and their families during difficult moments in life. Samuel Carter quietly watched from the back of the room as Damian invited Naomi to stand beside him. There were no dramatic speeches and no extravagant displays of wealth. Damian simply looked at the audience before speaking with complete honesty. "I spent many years believing that control solved every problem," he said. "Someone taught me that trust solves the problems control never can." His eyes briefly met Naomi's, and she smiled with the quiet understanding that had always defined her character. After the ceremony ended, they walked together through the estate gardens where colorful leaves drifted across the stone pathways. Damian stopped beside a small bench overlooking the lake, the same place where he often escaped after difficult days. "I never properly thanked you," he said. Naomi looked at him with gentle surprise. "You already apologized. That was enough." Damian slowly shook his head. "No, you gave me something much greater than forgiveness. You showed me the difference between protecting someone and trying to possess them." Naomi remained silent for a moment before answering with the calm wisdom that had guided every choice she made. "Trust is the only place where real love can grow. Without trust, every silence becomes fear. Every question becomes suspicion." Damian nodded, understanding those words more deeply than ever before. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a simple envelope. Inside was a handwritten invitation asking Naomi to join the Sullivan Foundation as Director of Employee Wellness while continuing to shape every program they would build together. It was not presented as a reward or an obligation. It was an invitation to become a trusted partner in work that mattered to them both. Naomi accepted with quiet gratitude because she recognized the true meaning behind the offer. It was built upon respect instead of authority and confidence instead of control. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Chicago skyline, the estate settled into peaceful silence once again. The cold man who once believed power could protect his heart had discovered that vulnerability required far greater courage, while the compassionate caregiver who had quietly carried the weight of her own struggles found someone willing to stand beside her without taking away her independence. Their story was never defined by jealousy or misunderstanding in the end. It became a reminder that the strongest relationships are not built by holding on more tightly, but by learning to trust with an open heart. And that day, everyone closest to them witnessed what true dignity, respect, and love could look like when they finally walked together instead of apart.